Okay, let's see. Number 14. The reef you can only photograph. Below you, the coral sea shifts from deep blue to electric turquoise. Through the aircraft window, a perfect heart appears in the reef, so precise it looks designed, placed there, and guarded. The pilot banks, cameras rise. No one gets out. There is no dock below, no beach, no trail, no swimmer crossing the lagoon. Hart Reef lies within Hardy Reef, in Australia's Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and it is viewed mainly from helicopters, seaplanes, and light aircraft. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority manages the surrounding waters through zoning, permits, and site-specific operating conditions. Those controls do not make every form of access impossible in every circumstance, but ordinary visitor tours do not put passengers into the water at Hart Reef itself. The familiar experience is an aerial pass. At 19 degrees, 46 minutes south, off Queensland's Whitsunday Islands, the aircraft makes another slow turn. Hart Reef is a small natural formation whose outline only becomes clear from above. From this height, it looks solid. Dark coral walls, bright blue water, a shape clean enough for a brochure. From the cabin, it can look like rock. Beneath the surface, it is alive. Coral is not a slab of stone lying on the seafloor. Countless tiny animals built it layer by layer, over spans of time no holiday itinerary can measure. The pale ridges and dark patches below the window are habitat. Fish shelter there. Coral grows there. Storms break over it. That living structure is already under pressure far beyond a visitor's reach. The Great Barrier Reef has experienced repeated mass coral bleaching events, driven by marine heat waves. Bleaching does not mean every coral dies immediately, but severe or repeated heat stress can strip corals of the algae that help feed them, leaving less time to recover between events. A heart-shaped outline can survive in a photograph, while the reef communities that create its color and texture are weakened below the surface. Hart Reef is not outside tourism. It is part of a managed tourism system with a very specific access pattern. Flights leave from Airlie Beach, Hamilton Island, and the Whitsunday coast. The pilot finds the angle. Passengers lean toward the glass. The heart appears below. Commercial aircraft operators must comply with aviation rules, including minimum height requirements, except when taking off or landing, and with conditions attached to their operations in the marine park. For passengers, the practical consequence is simple. The aircraft can circle for the view without creating a landing site, swimming stop, or vessel congregation at the formation. A short distance away, Hardy Reef offers almost the opposite experience. Tourist pontoons operate in the wider reef area. Visitors enter the water there. They snorkel and dive. Boats use established facilities and moorings, rather than treating every reef edge as a place to stop. This distinction matters. The marine park's management framework can direct high-volume activity towards sites built to receive it, while the aerial attraction remains a passover location, rather than another in-water hub. The boats are there. The infrastructure is there. The visitors are already there. But the heart is not used like the pontoon reefs. That difference is not just aesthetic. Anchoring can damage coral when an anchor or chain contacts the seabed, which is why Great Barrier Reef Marine Park rules and visitor guidance restrict anchoring in many sensitive areas, and promote designated moorings where available. There is no evidence needed to imagine an anchor at Hart Reef in order to understand the management logic. Concentrating vessel activity at approved sites reduces the number of uncontrolled contact points across fragile reef habitat. One swimmer can seem harmless, one hand on coral, one fin brushing a shallow edge, one person steadying themselves for a photograph. But a site made famous by a single, recognizable shape would not receive one visitor. It would receive a repeated demand for the same close-up, a boat positioned for the best angle, a group held in shallow water, a photograph made without glass between the camera and the reef. The consequence would not necessarily arrive as one dramatic break. It could accumulate as abrasion, sediment stirred by fins, accidental contact, and disturbance concentrated on the same small formation. In a reef already facing heat stress, recovery depends on conditions that tourism cannot guarantee. What is missing below the aircraft is part of the design of the visit. No beach, no ladder, no floating platform beside the heart, no advertised in-water stop. Those absences do not make the reef untouched. Aircraft noise, emissions, climate change, and the wider footprint of tourism still exist. They do limit the most direct kind of pressure, repeated physical contact at the exact formation people came to see. From above, that can look excessive. A few meters of coral, isolated within a reef system large enough for boats, pontoons, aircraft, and full-day tours. Yet the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is managed through different kinds of access, not a simple division between visitors and wilderness. Hardy Reef can host pontoons and guided water activities. Hart Reef can remain primarily an aerial landmark within the same tourism landscape. The pilot completes the turn. The Hart narrows, then slips behind the wing. Below, no anchor falls, and no tour group enters the water at the formation. But the protection model depends on more than keeping people at a distance. If warming seas bleach the coral again, or demand grows for closer access, the view from the aircraft may become the least difficult part to manage. Number 13. The arch that tourists were wearing away. In 1980, the path across one of Europe's largest sandstone arches was closed. The arch was still there. No fence hid it. People could still reach the area, but they could no longer walk across its crown. Near the village of Herensko in Bohemian Switzerland, Pravčická Brána spans 26.5 meters of open air. The opening beneath it rises 16 meters high. At its narrowest point, the sandstone is only 3 meters thick. For decades, visitors climbed onto that stone bridge, stood over the void, and walked across the surface that made the view possible. From below, it looks permanent. A pale arch lifts out of the forest, broad enough to frame the sky. Water and wind shaped it over geological time. But it is not a viewing platform built by engineers. It is what remained after weaker rock around it disappeared. By the late 18th century, people were already making the journey to see it. In 1826, an inn was built beside the formation. A strange sandstone shape became a destination. Then, in 1881, Prince Edmund Clary Aldringen ordered the Falcon's Nest built beside the gate. The hotel-like structure clung to the rock. Travelers could eat there, rest there, and look out over the Bohemian landscape. The buildings beside the arch made the place easier to reach. You arrived at the Falcon's Nest, crossed the viewpoints, and climbed onto the crown of Pravčická Brána. The reward came at once. Forest below, cliffs in the distance, empty space under your feet. The problem was not vandalism or reckless stunts. Repeated foot traffic wore down the upper sandstone surface, where the arch was already vulnerable. Sandstone erodes grain by grain. Boots polished, loosened, and removed material from a natural structure with no spare layer beneath it. The closure came in stages. In 1980, access along the route over the arch was stopped. In 1982, the prohibition on entering the top of Pravčická Gate was formally established as a protective measure. Visitors could still enter the surrounding complex, stand beneath the arch, and photograph it from designated viewpoints. They could follow the old line with their eyes. They just could not put their weight on it. That is what makes the place unusual. It is not a sealed military site. It is not a remote island beyond public reach. The forbidden surface hangs overhead in plain view. The arch has also received conservation work. Reports on its preservation describe stabilization measures using protective resin-based material on vulnerable sandstone areas. Such work was intended to limit deterioration, not to restore the crown as a public trail. The basic rule remained unchanged. The top was no longer a place for visitors. Footsteps were only one force acting on the sandstone. Wind crosses the ridge. Rain enters cracks. Frost expands water inside the rock. Temperature changes work on the structure year after year. The arch exists because erosion carved it. That process has never stopped. Then, in 2022, a different threat transformed the landscape around it. A major wildfire swept through Bohemian Switzerland near Herensko, burning extensive forest and forcing closures across the national park. Pravčická Brána was not directly burned, but the fire changed access to it. Damaged slopes, fallen trees, unstable terrain, and the risk of renewed fires meant that trails and approach routes had to be assessed, closed, rerouted, and reopened gradually. The issue was no longer only whether people could stand on the arch, it was whether they could safely reach the viewpoints at all. For a landmark like this, the surrounding forest is part of the protection system. It carries visitors toward the site, controls where they walk, and gives emergency services access when conditions turn dangerous. After the fire, that system was disrupted. A path may lead toward the arch one season and be closed the next because the ground, trees, or weather have made the route unsafe. The national park and local authorities have continued to manage access through marked routes and temporary restrictions. Conditions can change after storms, drought, fire risk, or trail damage. The arch cannot be moved indoors, covered with glass, or replaced with a replica. Its protection depends on decisions made across the entire landscape around it. You stand below the opening and look up. The arch seems wide enough to carry a road. It carried tourists for generations, but its survival does not depend on whether the view feels solid. It depends on how much sandstone remains where no visitor is allowed to stand, and on whether the forested routes below can safely bring people close enough to see it. The path closed in 1980. The wind did not. Number 12. The painting's human breath nearly destroyed. Dear Monsieur Bruy, the message said in September 1940, 4 boys have discovered paintings in a cave near Montignac. On September 12th, 17-year-old apprentice mechanic Marcel Ravida returned to a hole in the hillside above the village of Montignac. 4 days earlier, he had spotted it while walking with his dog, Robot. This time, he brought Jacques Marçal, Georges Agnel, and Simon Coincas. They widened the opening, lit a makeshift lamp, and climbed into the dark. For roughly 30 meters, the passage tightened around them. The ground fell away beneath their feet. Then their light struck the walls. Animals emerged from the limestone. Massive bulls, horses, deer, figures in black, red, yellow, and brown. These were not casual scratches in stone. The lines carried movement and intent. People from the Upper Paleolithic had made them thousands of years before Montignac, France, had a name. The boys returned the next day with a rope. Ravida descended an 8-meter shaft. Below the main galleries, he found the image now called the shaft scene, a wounded bison facing a human figure. It remains one of the cave's strangest paintings, placed where no one would see it by simply passing through. Their teacher, Léon Laval, entered on September 18th. 3 days later, prehistorian Henri Breuil examined the walls and authenticated them. The cave was real, the animals were ancient. A sealed underground chamber had become an international discovery. The first message about Lascaux said nothing about what would damage it. No collapse, no poisonous air, no hidden trap. The threat came in with the visitors, breathing. The ancient gallery damaged by modern breath became number 12. Lascaux opened to the public on July 13, 1948. Visitors came to see hundreds of painted animals and symbols with their own eyes. They crossed the chambers where the 4 boys had stood beneath their improvised lamp. They stared at bulls, horses, stags, and the human figure in the shaft. Every group changed the cave. Bodies brought heat, moisture, carbon dioxide, and dust from shoes and clothing. Visitors carried microorganisms from the outside world. Artificial lights illuminated the walls. They also gave algae energy to grow. For millennia, the cave had remained stable. Temperature, humidity, darkness, and air circulation held a narrow balance around the paintings. Public access disrupted it in less than 2 decades. In 1958 and 1959, Marcel Ravida and Jacques Marçal, 2 of the boys who had found the cave, saw green growth inside. Their discovery was changing in front of them. Algae spread through spaces that had known only darkness. Calcite deposits formed over painted surfaces. Humidity shifted. The cave had become a damaged biological system. No painted bull disappeared overnight. No wall cracked open. Damage accumulated after every tour. More moisture, more carbon dioxide, more light. A living film crept across images that had survived ice ages, wars, and the growth of every city above them. On April 20th, 1963, France permanently closed the original cave to the public. From outside, the decision sounds simple: close the door and save the paintings. But Lascaux had already changed. Attempts to stabilize its atmosphere and control biological growth created further complications over the following decades. The cave had been opened to the modern world. Closing it again did not remove what that world had left behind. Marçal later became the cave's guardian. As a teenager, he had crawled into the darkness because a hole in a hill led somewhere unknown. As an adult, he protected that same place by keeping nearly everyone else out. Visitors can still see Lascaux. In 2016, Lascaux 4 opened with a full-scale reproduction of the cave. Earlier, Lascaux 2 recreated major sections of the painted galleries. The replicas show the scale, color, and movement that made the original famous. they do not hold the original air. Lascaux is not closed because no one can reach it. It is closed because people reached it. Above Montignac, tourists enter a reconstruction built for them. Beneath the hill, the real painted walls remain behind controlled doors, where even a human breath counts as contamination. Number 11. The shrine behind the fence. At the top of the stone steps, the approach ends at a curtain. A visitor to Issei's inner shrine can stand before the gate, bow, and pray. Beyond the curtain rise wooden fences, one behind another, with only a fragment of roofline visible above them. 4 layers enclose the main sanctuary. Ordinary worshippers reach the gate at the third fence. Photography stops there. The center remains out of sight. The walk to that point has already crossed a boundary. In Mie Prefecture, the Uji Bridge carries visitors more than 100 meters over the Isuzu River. On the far side, the path enters forest and climbs toward the shrine dedicated to Amaterasu, the sun deity traditionally linked to Japan's imperial family. But the final view is not a view. At the hidden center is the sacred mirror associated with Amaterasu. It is not displayed in a case, brought out for pilgrims, or available for public inspection. A visitor at the curtain is asked to accept that it is there, without being allowed to turn belief into visual proof. That absence creates a practical problem for anyone arriving with a camera, a guidebook, or a historian's questions. Issei offers no artifact label, no gallery route, no point where an ordinary visitor can compare a famous claim with the object itself. The shrine does not answer the demand to see more by opening another door. Instead, it changes what must be watched. The building behind the fences is rebuilt every 20 years. During Shikinen Sengu, a new sanctuary is constructed beside the old one. Sacred objects are transferred in ceremonies not open for general viewing, and the previous structure is dismantled. The most recent completed rebuilding, the 62nd Shikinen Sengu, took place in 2013. The next cycle is scheduled to culminate in 2033. That schedule is not distant information on a plaque. It is already shaping the grounds around the visitor. Timber, craft, processions, and preparation become signs that the place behind the curtain is moving toward another transfer. Issei's wider complex contains 125 shrines, yet the inner shrine remains its most restricted point. Its rebuilding tradition has continued for roughly 1,300 years. The wood does not survive from the beginning. The method does. Proportions, tools, craft knowledge, ritual timing, and the obligation to make the sanctuary again. For the visitor at the third fence, that means the mystery is not simply hidden in an old object. It is hidden in an event. The mirror cannot be publicly examined, but neither can the decisive moment of its movement. When a rebuilding cycle reaches its climax, the question is not whether a new building has been completed. It is what, exactly, crosses from the old sanctuary into the new one, and how the identity of the shrine is understood to cross with it. The old structure is taken down. The new one stands beside it. The sacred center is transferred under ritual conditions that remain beyond the ordinary worshipper's view. The architecture can be renewed in public stages, but the act that gives the renewal its meaning withdraws behind the boundary. In 2026, that boundary has a public edge. Okihiki, the timber hauling ceremonies associated with the next rebuilding cycle, allow participants to help pull timber intended for sacred construction. Hands grip ropes. Timber moves through the crowd. The work appears communal, loud, and physical. Then the material goes where the public cannot follow. That cut changes the meaning of the fence. It is not merely a barrier around an inaccessible treasure. It separates participation from completion. A visitor may help move the timber that will become part of the sanctuary, then return to the same curtain without seeing the finished center or the transfer that consecrates it. A forbidden ruin is often closed because it is fragile. Walls may collapse, pigments may fade, air may damage what remains. Issei presents a different risk. Its buildings are renewed precisely so that decay will not be allowed to define the place. What must be protected is not failing material, but the conditions under which a ritual can remain more than a performance for spectators. The physical distance at the gate is small. The separation is not. Cedar forest, stone steps, and a short final approach bring the visitor almost to the sanctuary, yet the layered fences prevent the last step from becoming a claim of possession. The shrine can be photographed only up to a point. It can be described only up to a point. It can be approached, but not completed by the visitor's gaze. Publicly available shrine guidance identifies the worship area as the limit for ordinary visitors, while access within the innermost precincts is restricted. Imperial participation is associated with specific shrine rites, including formal offerings and major ceremonies, but that does not turn the closed sanctuary into a place open for general observation. At the gate, the distinction is visible in the curtain itself. Worship is permitted, entry is not. The next transfer is still ahead. Before 2033, timber will be selected, shaped, hauled, and assembled. The roofline will rise again behind the fences. Then, during the concealed ceremonies, something will leave the old sanctuary and enter the new one. At the curtain, the unanswered question is no longer whether the mirror can be seen. It is whether the thing being transferred is an object, a deity, a lineage of ritual, or something that exists only because no ordinary visitor is allowed to watch it cross. Number 10. The island that must not be touched. On November 14, 1963, at 7:15 in the morning, sailors south of Iceland saw black clouds forcing their way out of the Atlantic. The eruption had begun 130 meters below the surface, about 18 kilometers southwest of Heimaey. Seawater struck magma. Steam exploded upward. Ash followed. By the next day, volcanic debris had piled high enough above the waves for new land to appear. There were no trees, grass, insects, nests, or soil. Only hot ash, fractured lava, salt spray, and waves trying to tear the island apart. Every living thing that reached this black ground could leave a clue: a seed blown across the sea, a beetle carried by wind, a gull with mud on its feet, a microbe in a drop of rain. Researchers needed to know what arrived first, and whether it arrived without human help. On December 6th, while the eruption briefly weakened, 3 journalists from Paris Match stepped ashore. They planted a flag. Explosions intensified, and they fled. 10 days later, Icelandic geologists Sigurður Þórarinsson and Thorbjörn Sigurgeirsson landed to collect samples. The island was still forming beneath their boots. It was not a destination. It was a live experiment with no reset button. By May 1965, Iceland had declared Surtsey a nature reserve. Ordinary visitors were barred, while lava still poured into the sea. The eruption continued until June 5, 1967. At its largest, the island covered 2.65 square kilometers and rose 174 meters above the North Atlantic. Once the fire stopped, the record of life could begin. A bare island can show how life reaches land that has never held it before. Organisms may arrive on wind, waves, bird droppings, feathers, or driftwood, but the evidence means little if people carried the first arrivals in. A person does not need to intend harm. A boot sole can carry grains of harbor soil, a grass seed from a road verge, fungal spores too small to see, or insect eggs hidden in a seam. A dropped crumb can feed an animal that would otherwise fail to survive. Waste can introduce bacteria, and contamination did not remain only a theoretical danger. In 1969, researchers found a tomato plant growing on Surtsey. It was not treated as proof that a tomato had crossed the Atlantic by itself. The plant was removed because its presence raised the possibility of a human source, discarded food, seed, or other material brought to the island. One unexpected plant could blur the line between colonization and introduction. Then researchers are no longer watching nature's first move. They are studying an accidental delivery. Access became tightly controlled. Landing requires authorization. Bringing organisms, seeds, soil, or waste is prohibited. The protected area extends far beyond the visible island, encompassing roughly 65 square kilometers of land and surrounding sea. Restrictions on activity in nearby waters help protect the seabed and shoreline habitats as they develop, while also limiting disturbance around the island's natural laboratory. Yet, Surtsey was never as untouched as the word suggests. Human tracks were preserved in volcanic material that later hardened. Someone crossed the young island while its surface was still soft. The marks are a physical contradiction. Surtsey exists to document life without human interference, yet its earliest surface records human presence. That does not mean every plant and bird on Surtsey came from people. Scientists documented the gradual arrival of organisms and the growth of a functioning ecosystem. Birds brought nutrients. Plants established themselves. Insects appeared. Soil formed where there had been only ash and lava. For the first arrivals, though, certainty matters. A seed near a landing site may have blown in from Iceland. It may have washed ashore, or it may have arrived with people who came to observe the experiment. One unexplained plant can change the story of what came next. In 2008, UNESCO placed Surtsey on the World Heritage List, not because it is easy to visit, but because it is almost impossible to replace. No government can manufacture another newborn volcanic island, remove every contaminating trace, and wait 60 years for a natural ecosystem to assemble. Waves still strip material from its coasts. Wind still carries seeds over the Atlantic. Birds still land, leave, and alter the record without knowing it. Scientists can return under strict controls, but each visit carries the same risk, the observer becoming the cause. The tomato plant was removed. Its exact route to Surtsey was never established. Was it carried by wind or water? Was it dropped by a bird, or did it arrive in something brought ashore by a person? Number 9. The Australian territory, almost nobody reaches. On November 25, 1853, Captain John Heard was crossing the Southern Ocean aboard the merchant ship Oriental when a white shape appeared through the weather. At first, he took it for an enormous iceberg. Then the cloud broke. The white mass was still there. It was land, rising from an ocean where his charts showed none. The territory Australia now tightly controls lies 4,100 kilometers southwest of Perth and 1,700 kilometers north of Antarctica. Heard Island is not a remote beach with a warning sign. It is a sub-Antarctic volcanic island dominated by Big Ben, a 2,745-meter massif with active volcanic features beneath ice and cloud. The restrictions begin before anyone reaches shore, but they do not all mean the same thing. Australia's permit system governs access to Heard Island and the McDonald Islands, a protected reserve where landing, scientific work, cargo handling, and other activities require approval. The islands also sit within Australia's 12 nautical mile territorial sea, where Australia exercises authority over navigation and access under its domestic and international legal framework. Entering those waters is not identical to landing on the islands, and a vessel may not treat offshore waters as a loophole. Anchoring, approaching sensitive areas, putting people ashore, flying aircraft, or leaving equipment can each require authorization and must comply with reserve conditions. Most applications must arrive at least 5 months before departure. Complex expeditions may need 7. Those rules exist because Heard Island has already shown what distance fails to stop. Within years of Captain Heard's sighting, American sealing crews were landing on its beaches. They came for elephant seals, whose blubber could be rendered into oil. The crews did not need roads, harbors, or permanent buildings. They needed a landing place, knives, furnaces, and enough bodies to process animals faster than the population could recover. The island's remoteness delayed the sealers. It did not save the seals. Australia took administrative control in 1947. On November 28 that year, expedition leader Stuart Campbell and 13 other men departed Fremantle for Heard Island. In December, at Lascaux Cove, Campbell raised the Australian flag beside a new research station. 14 people stood at one of the wettest, loneliest outposts on Earth. Rain fell roughly 3 days out of 4. Wind drove through the cove. Behind the station, glaciers descended from the mountain. Beyond it lay thousands of kilometers of ocean in every direction. The station operated until 1955. Then it closed. Its departure did not erase what people had brought. Old buildings, machinery, fuel remnants, and discarded materials remained. The island was becoming valuable for what it still had, an ecosystem with almost no introduced species. That is the purpose of biosecurity. Heard Island changes constantly without human help. Its glaciers have retreated, exposing fresh ground for plants and microbes to colonize. On nearby McDonald Island, volcanic activity resumed after 75,000 years of dormancy and substantially enlarged the island. Land is still being made, stripped back, and repopulated here in real time. An introduced organism could alter that experiment permanently. Seeds, insects, microbes, or soil carried in on boots, cargo, sampling gear, or damp fabric can establish where they do not belong. In a place with few introduced species, the danger is not merely untidy equipment. It is the possibility that a visitor changes which life can survive on newly exposed ground. That is why permits reach beyond permission to visit. They impose controls on what arrives, what goes ashore, and what must leave again. In 1997, UNESCO listed Heard Island and the McDonald Islands as a World Heritage Property, covering 658,903 hectares, recognizing the islands as an unusually intact record of geological and biological processes. On January 24, 2025, Australia's expanded marine reserve reached about 380,000 square kilometers, extending protection across the surrounding ocean as well as the land. The scale matters because the island is not isolated from the sea around it. Seabirds feed far beyond the coastline. Marine mammals move through waters no fence can enclose. A boundary in the Southern Ocean holds only if ships respect it, and only against threats that ships can carry. During tightly controlled voyages in 2025 and 2026, scientists traveled aboard the RSV Nuyina. They monitored wildlife, removed waste from the old Lascaux Cave station, and followed biosecurity procedures before going ashore. The teams removed 800 kilograms of inert waste and 300 kilograms of asbestos from the former station. They also found H5 bird flu on Heard Island. This was a different kind of breach. The island can restrict ships, aircraft, tourists, and researchers. It can require permits months in advance. It can inspect and control every item unloaded from a vessel. But migratory birds do not arrive at a port. They cross the Southern Ocean without clearance, carrying viruses across distances that once protected the island from people. H5 does not mean every bird, seal, or colony will be devastated, but it introduces a threat that cannot be solved by cleaning gear, removing station waste, or tightening a landing permit. The next question is whether the virus remains a passing arrival, or moves through the island's birds and into the wildlife that depends on them. Number 8. The movie beach that had to close. In 2018, marine biologists entered Maya Bay after the last tourist boats had gone. The water was still. Limestone walls rose almost 100 meters above the white sand, made famous around the world. No engines idled in the shallows. No ferries reversed toward the beach. No thousands of feet crossed the sand before noon. For the scientists, the silence was not scenery. It was evidence of what had been missing. Time for the bay to function without a fleet passing through it. In 2000, Danny Boyle released The Beach, with Leonardo DiCaprio playing a traveler chasing an untouched paradise. Maya Bay became the image audiences carried home. Turquoise water, pale sand, cliffs closing the world into a private tropical chamber. The film did not invent the bay. It made the bay globally recognizable. And recognition arrived by boat. By 2018, Thai authorities said Maya Bay could receive as many as 5,000 visitors in a single day. Speedboats crossed the shallow water from morning onward. Ferries delivered more passengers. Anchors scraped coral. Propellers churned the shallows. Exhaust, sunscreen, litter, noise, and human volume accumulated in an ecosystem built around clear water and slow recovery. A beach can absorb footprints. A reef cannot absorb a fleet. On June 1, 2018, Thailand closed Maya Bay for 4 months. The forecast assumed that removing swimmers and boats would give damaged coral a brief window to recover. But when biologists examined the reef, they found that the injury was deeper than a seasonal pause. Coral colonies damaged by anchors and repeated disturbance were not rebuilding on a 4-month timetable. The water might look clear from the sand, while the living structure beneath it remained weakened. Authorities faced a practical danger. Reopening on the old terms could turn a damaged reef into a permanently depleted one. The 4-month closure became indefinite. For about 3.5 years, one of Thailand's most photographed beaches was off limits because successful access had become the threat. The same shallow inlet that made Maya Bay look secluded had concentrated boats, wake, and passengers into a narrow ecological space. If that traffic resumed before the reef could recover, the bay risked losing the habitat that made its clear water and marine life possible. There was an earlier wound. Before mass tourism overwhelmed the bay, the film production itself drew controversy for alterations to the beach landscape. In 2006, Thailand's Supreme Court upheld a case concerning environmental harm linked to the production. Rehabilitation continued after the cameras and crew had gone. That history mattered in 2018. Maya Bay was not beginning from untouched conditions. Scientists and officials were trying to protect a place already altered for an image, then overrun by people seeking that image. When Maya Bay reopened on January 1, 2022, it did not reopen as it had been. Boats were barred from entering the bay itself and had to approach from another side of Koh Phi Phi Lay. Visitors reached the beach by a controlled landward route. Swimming was restricted. Daily access was managed. Those rules were not cosmetic. Keeping boats outside removed the immediate sources of anchor damage, propeller strikes, exhaust, and constant wake from the inlet. But it also moved pressure elsewhere. The landing area, walkways, viewing points, waste systems, and narrow approach now had to carry visitors without reproducing the same pattern of overload on land. The authorities were no longer deciding whether people should see Maya Bay. They were testing whether the bay could receive people without being asked to survive another 5,000-person day. Recovery brought a visible sign in 2024. During a June survey, officials recorded 92 black-tip reef sharks around Maya Bay. The count was not a declaration that the ecosystem had returned to an untouched past. Sharks can move, and a single survey cannot measure every part of reef health. But their return changed the stakes of access. The sheltered water was no longer merely a backdrop for visitors. It was again being used by marine life. More noise, more boats, or weaker enforcement would not just damage coral that tourists could not see. It could disrupt an area where sharks had begun to return. That made the rules harder to relax. A reopened beach now contained evidence that the exclusion had worked, and evidence that recovery could still be reversed. In 2024, authorities closed Maya Bay again from August 1st to September 30th for environmental rehabilitation and monsoon season safety. The seasonal shutdown was not a return to the crisis of 2018, but it showed that access remained conditional. Rough weather, maintenance needs, and ecological stress could still override the tourism schedule. The next closure would not require another global catastrophe or a dramatic collapse visible from the sand. It could begin with smaller warnings: coral damage near the shoreline, crowding beyond the managed route, wildlife retreating from the inlet, or monsoon conditions making the controlled approach unsafe. Officially, Maya Bay is open, but on a quiet morning, the most important sign is still offshore. Boats waiting outside the bay while the water inside remains undisturbed. The boundary holds only as long as the reef, the sharks, and the people assigned to protect them can hold it. Number 7. The vault built for the end of agriculture. Sealed boxes may one day cross the snow-covered ground outside Longyearbyen, Norway, carrying crops that may not survive where they were born. A planned June 17, 2026 deposit is expected to include 15,387 seed samples from 11 gene banks: pearl millet, sorghum, chickpeas, lentils, wheat, rice, beans, and cowpea. Some samples are expected from Sudan, where preserving agricultural collections has become especially difficult. Burkina Faso and Niger may deposit seeds there for the first time. The boxes would enter a tunnel cut 120 meters into Plateau Mountain. Behind restricted doors, the temperature is held at -18 degrees Celsius. This is the locked room holding humanity's backup harvest. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault opened on February 26, 2008, because gene banks need somewhere to turn when their own protection fails. Its collection has grown to more than 1 million samples, each one a small duplicate sent by a gene bank elsewhere in the world. The number matters because every packet represents a decision made under local pressure. Which drought-tolerant wheat to keep, which rice can survive flooding, which bean still grows in poor soil. But the vault is not a public pantry, a museum collection, or a reserve anyone can claim. That rule keeps almost everybody out. The vault does not lend seeds to curious visitors, researchers, or governments that simply want access. Only the depositing gene bank can request its own material back. Restricted entry protects the cold chain and the legal custody of agricultural knowledge gathered far beyond Norway. A locked door, however, cannot grow a crop. The Syrian war showed what happens when a country needs its backup. The International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas, known as ICARDA, held one of the world's major collections of seeds adapted to dry lands: wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, and forage crops. Generations of breeding had shaped these plants to survive heat, drought, poor soils, and short rainfall. Its gene bank stood near Aleppo. Then war made normal work impossible. Seeds are not safe merely because they sit in a building. They need electricity, staff, secure roads, working freezers, and fields where they can be grown again before viability declines. When those systems fail, preservation becomes an evacuation. In 2015, Akarta asked Svalbard to return part of its deposit. In 2017, it withdrew more. These became the vault's first major real-world recovery withdrawals. Boxes left the Arctic for new working collections in Lebanon and Morocco. Opening the mountain and retrieving the duplicates was the easy part. The vault could return genetic material, but it could not restore research stations, field crews, seed processing equipment, or the agricultural landscape around Aleppo. A packet comes off a frozen shelf. Then someone must plant it, protect the crop from drought, pests, conflict, and theft, harvest it, test it, catalog it, dry it, and distribute it. Without those linked systems, the seed remains only a possibility. -18 degrees slows the aging of dormant samples for decades. Permafrost around the mountain was intended to add passive cold if machinery failed. Norway spent about €8.3 million building the facility because the collection needed to survive power failures as well as political emergencies. Its entrance was deliberately visible, a sharp, illuminated wedge against Arctic darkness. The architects believed a landmark could be safer than a hidden bunker. Local residents could notice suspicious activity. Then the Arctic changed the calculation. During the winter of 2016-17, unusually warm and wet weather sent meltwater into the vault's access tunnel. The water did not reach the seed chambers. No samples were damaged, but water had entered the approach to a global refuge, whose security partly depended on frozen ground. Norway responded with an upgrade costing about €20 million. The tunnel was improved, drainage and waterproofing were strengthened, and cooling systems and supporting infrastructure were reinforced. The intervention reduced one known danger: water moving through the access route. It did not remove the larger dependency. Pumps, drainage, refrigeration, sensors, roads, communications, trained workers, and reliable power now carry more of the burden once assigned to the mountain itself. If warming brings repeated thaw and freeze damage, or a prolonged failure disables those systems during an emergency, the vault may still protect its sealed chambers, but recovery could become slower, precisely when a damaged gene bank has no time to wait. That is the next unresolved threat. A collection elsewhere may be failing because of war, flood, fire, or political collapse, while access to its Arctic duplicate is constrained by the same changing climate the vault was meant to outlast. In that delay, the loss is not just a packet of seed. It is a variety no longer growing in its home region, and the breeding history encoded in it. The vault exists for disasters too large for a single gene bank to absorb. It is a safeguard for crop diversity, not a replacement for the living institutions that keep diversity usable. Climate change threatens harvests in the fields, but it also strains the Arctic conditions chosen to protect their backups. If the planned June 2026 deposit proceeds, the Sudanese boxes would join seeds intended for many agricultural futures: grains for dry fields, legumes for protein, rice for flooded land, peppers and beans for local diets. Each would enter as a duplicate, not a promise. The question is not whether a seed can survive in darkness. It is whether, when the original collection is gone and the systems needed to revive it are failing, anyone can recover that seed in time. Number 6. The tomb archaeologists refused to open. The work had not yet been completed when the first emperor passed away, wrote the historian Sima Qian, more than a century after Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE. He described an underground palace beneath a burial mound, a ceiling of heavenly bodies, landscapes cast in metal, and rivers made to flow with mercury. He wrote of crossbows set to fire at intruders. For 2,000 years, the account sounded like imperial legend. Then, on March 23, 1974, the soil near Xiyang village began giving up pieces of it. A drought had driven farmer Yang Jifa and his relatives to dig a well 35 kilometers east of Xi'an. Their shovels struck broken pottery instead of water. They pulled up fragments from the dry yellow soil: an ear, a sleeve, part of a face. Archaeologist Zhao Kongmin examined the pieces. He recognized life-size figures from the Qin dynasty. Formal excavation of Pit 1 began on July 15th. Beneath the fields stood ranks of soldiers, horses, chariots, officials, entertainers, armor, and animals. They were part of a necropolis built for the man who unified China. The famous army was never the emperor's burial chamber. Its principal pits stand about 1.22 kilometers from the central mound. Visitors look down on thousands of terracotta faces. The emperor they served remains physically out of reach. The outer guard has been opened. The ruler behind it has not. The first excavations showed why. Many warriors were originally painted in vivid color. Their armor, faces, and clothing were not meant to be the dusty earthen browns seen in museums today. Pigments sat over a thin layer of lacquer. Once excavators exposed that surface to ordinary air, the damage began almost immediately. Within 15 seconds, the lacquer could start to change. Within 4 minutes, it could detach. A soldier buried for more than 2,000 years could lose parts of his original appearance before the team around him finished documenting the discovery. The terracotta army proved the scale of the first emperor's underground world. It also showed how quickly that world could be damaged by excavation. The emperor's chamber remains beyond archaeology's safe reach. From a distance, the mound looks almost ordinary, a broad, wooded rise in the landscape. Yet it stands at the center of a World Heritage property, covering 56.25 square kilometers, with more than 600 recorded sites and nearly 200 accompanying pits. The army is only one visible part of a far larger burial complex. Sima Qian made the unseen center sound almost impossible. He described craftsmen building palaces and towers underground. He described rare objects and treasures placed inside. He described Mercury, arranged to imitate the rivers, seas, and oceans of an empire. Celestial bodies shone from the ceiling above. The crossbows are harder to verify. No one has entered the chamber to find them. Mercury has left traces above ground. In 1985, a soil survey detected a strong mercury anomaly over the mound. Decades later, a 2020 laser radar study found elevated atmospheric mercury in patterns consistent with those earlier results. The readings do not prove that liquid mercury rivers still run through an intact subterranean landscape. They cannot show how much mercury lies below, or whether another source produced the results. Still, one part of the ancient account may be more than imagination. Opening the chamber would not simply reveal an archaeological site. It would alter the site permanently. Air would enter, humidity would shift, microorganisms could arrive. Materials stable in sealed darkness might crack, oxidize, collapse, or vanish. Painted surfaces would face the danger already seen on the warriors, perhaps on a scale no conservator can control. Wood, silk, paper-like fibers, lacquer, pigments, and organic remains may have survived only because nobody reached them. A tomb can be excavated once. There is no second sealed chamber beneath the first attempt. Researchers survey the mound without opening it. They map, sample, scan, and measure from the outside. Beside the terracotta army's vast open pits, that restraint can look unsatisfying. It comes from a hard limit. Do not destroy the evidence in order to see it. The barrier may protect people from what lies inside. It may also protect what lies inside from people. If mercury remains concentrated below the mound, entering could create a physical hazard. The more immediate danger is already known. Archaeologists saw what exposure did to the objects recovered outside. The army became a warning from the emperor's perimeter. Since 210 BCE, the chamber beneath the hill has remained sealed. Number 5. The base designed to be invisible. At dawn on August 1, 1955, Tony LeVere pushed a strange new aircraft across the white floor of Groom Lake, Nevada. He was supposed to keep it on the ground. The dry lake bed had no ordinary runway markings, no clear edges, and almost nothing to tell a pilot how high he was. At about 70 knots, the U-2 lifted away from the lake by accident. LeVere was Lockheed's chief test pilot. Beneath him was an aircraft built for a mission that could not survive public discovery, looking down on the Soviet Union from altitudes ordinary fighters could not reach. The U-2 was so light, with wings so long and handling so unfamiliar, that once it rose, LeVere recalled being in utter amazement. Landing was worse. The endless pale surface erased the visual references a pilot needs to judge distance from the ground. One mistake on that first hop could have wrecked the aircraft, injured the pilot, and exposed a program the United States was still trying to hide. That unplanned takeoff became the first recorded U-2 flight at the place the world would later call Area 51. The name mattered less than the consequence of being seen there. In early 1955, the government set aside roughly 60 square miles around the Groom Lake bed, so the CIA and Lockheed could test an aircraft before outsiders understood what it was. Isolation was not legend, it was insurance. A hard natural surface gave pilots room to survive mistakes. Empty desert gave the program time to react if someone appeared where no one was supposed to be. Kelly Johnson tried to soften the camp's image with Paradise Ranch, and workers shortened that to the ranch, but the colder map label endured because concealment, not comfort, defined the place. Everyone who entered did so under control, because a leak here was not abstract. Workers were screened and compartmented. Most arrived by air to reduce who could watch the roads and count the traffic. The surrounding military ranges, patrol tracks, and warning signs were not just bureaucracy spread across the desert. They were a defensive delay. If a lost driver, hunter, or curious local moved too close, guards needed enough time to intercept before a camera, a pair of binoculars, or a single detailed description escaped into the world. By then, the stakes already reached far beyond Nevada. If secrecy failed, the damage would not end with embarrassment at the fence line. It could expose how the United States planned to peer into Soviet territory. Some of the strangest stories began when that secrecy failed overhead. In the late 1950s, people on the ground, including civilian pilots and police officers, reported bright objects moving where no known aircraft should have been. They saw them at extreme altitude, catching the sun long after lower aircraft had faded into dusk. In many cases, those witnesses were almost certainly seeing U-2s. The CIA later stated that, during part of the late 1950s, high-altitude U-2 operations were behind a substantial share of UFO reports received in that period. But clarifying those sightings in real time would have done more than calm the public. It would have signaled to adversaries that the United States possessed an aircraft operating far above expected limits. Silence protected the program, but it created a second hazard. The more officials refused to explain, the more every unexplained light risked becoming either public hysteria or foreign intelligence. Then the aircraft changed again, and so did the danger. On April 25, 1962, the first A-12 Oxcart test flight rose from the same lake bed. To the few people cleared to watch, it was a black, needle-shaped reconnaissance aircraft built to outrun threats at more than 3 times the speed of sound. To anyone who glimpsed it without context, it could only look wrong. Too dark, too fast, too unlike the familiar shapes of commercial or military flight. Its titanium skin and severe lines belonged to a level of aviation the public had never been invited to imagine. That raised the cost of a sighting. A mistaken report was no longer just local gossip about a strange light. It could trigger scrutiny from agencies that were not read into the project, prompt dangerous questions from air defense networks, or force denials so rigid that even credible witnesses sounded delusional. The problem at Groom Lake was not simply building secret aircraft. It was preventing a secret aircraft from being treated as an intruder by the very systems built to detect intruders. The mythology that formed around the base became useful and dangerous at the same time. Useful because wild stories about aliens and impossible machines drew attention away from specific terrestrial programs. Dangerous because myth made every real encounter harder to sort. A pilot could report a shape he could not identify. A deputy could log lights moving in ways that seemed impossible. A radar operator, lacking context, could read a track as a threat rather than a test. The official answer, if there was one, often had to stop at silence. The secret stayed protected, but each unresolved incident increased the chance of confusion, escalation, or a damaging mistake. On the ground, the risks were more direct. The desert around Groom Lake is a patchwork of restricted sites and overlapping boundaries, and a person who thinks he is approaching one line can cross another with very little warning beyond signs, patrol roads, and sensor-watched approaches. That is not just a legal technicality. In that region, a trespasser can be stopped, detained, and handed federal charges before ever seeing the installation he came to find. If he keeps moving after warnings, the encounter can turn from curiosity to armed confrontation in minutes. That danger surfaced publicly in September 2019, when the Storm Area 51 frenzy pushed crowds toward rural Nevada. The main perimeter was not overrun, but internet mythology had converted roadside pullouts and warning markers into a live security problem. The episode showed what had always been true at Groom Lake. The legend attracts people, but the response they meet is built for protection, not theater. The old explanation for many Cold War sightings is now part of the public record. Programs such as the U-2 and A-12 did generate reports that officials could not safely clarify at the time. But that answer closes only the oldest loop. It does not settle the present one. If people still report strange lights, impossible angles, or aircraft shapes that do not match anything publicly known, the question remains the same, only sharper now. What is flying out there that still cannot be explained without exposing whatever comes next? Number 4. The island where quarantine became a curse. What kind of place becomes more frightening after you remove the ghost story? On June 5, 1793, jurist Lorenzo Allugara was ordered to describe what Venice had just built on a small island in its lagoon. An Ottoman ship called the San Niccolò had arrived carrying suspected plague. Venice could not let that reach the city. It could not ignore the ship either. So Poveglia became a machine for sorting danger. Allugara's account is dry, administrative, almost calm. That is what makes it land. Inside the island's buildings, the possibly infected were separated from the healthy. Guards watched the approaches. Goods were moved into designated spaces to be handled and disinfected. Officials monitored the flow. This was not chaos. It was logistics under fear. A miniature border checkpoint built against a disease no wall could stop once it entered Venice. Poveglia's modern legend says it is terrifying because of what might haunt it. The documented history is harsher. It shows what people build when death is close enough to count, but still invisible. Which danger is being kept out today? Disease, collapsing buildings, or the crowds chasing a ghost story? For Venice in 1793, the answer was clear. The threat came by water, under sail, with cargo, crew, and incubation time. Poveglia was turned into an emergency quarantine station because a city of merchants understood one brutal fact. If even one infected arrival slipped through, the entire lagoon could pay for it. The island kept that role in one form or another after the immediate crisis. Research on the Venetian lagoon places Poveglia inside the wider maritime health system. During the Napoleonic period, from 1805 to 1814, it functioned as a confinement station again. The image sold now is a cursed island no one dares approach. The archive gives something colder: repeated use, official planning, controlled separation, and years in which human beings were processed according to whether they might carry contagion. That is Poveglia. The history is worse than the legend. Later, the island changed again. In 1922, the existing buildings were converted into a long-term care facility for elderly patients. That matters because the popular version of Poveglia usually jumps straight from plague to ghosts, as if nothing else happened there for more than a century. But institutions leave their own marks: beds, corridors, routines, dependency, decline. The facility remained in use until 1968, nearly half a century, long enough for an entire generation of Venetian life to pass through those walls, while the island stopped being an emergency outpost and became something quieter, slower, and in its own way, harder to look at. Then the hospital closed. That gave the myth its opening. After 1968, Poveglia lost its permanent public function. Buildings decayed, vegetation pushed through masonry, roof lines sagged above empty rooms. Academic work on the island notes that for a period it was not yet the global horror cliché people know now. Young people from nearby Giudecca used it informally for picnics, barbecues, sunbathing, even camping. An abandoned island in the lagoon was still an island in the lagoon. Reachable, usable, half ruined, half social. But imagination decays faster than stone. A place with a medical past, shuttered windows, and no ordinary civic purpose does not stay empty for long. Folklore moves in. Soon, Poveglia was no longer an island with a documented quarantine history and a closed care institution. It became the haunted island, flattened into a single marketable word: forbidden. That word draws people, not because records mention Allugara, or because Venice built controlled quarantine zones in 1793, but because a locked ruin promises trespass, footage, and a story to post afterward. The barrier now does two jobs at once. It keeps people away from a site that is unstable, restricted, and historically sensitive. It also protects the site from the kind of attention that turns every broken ward into a set piece. You can see that pushback in the modern fight over the island itself. In 2014, more than 4,500 contributors backed a civic campaign that raised about €460,000 to resist privatization and argue that Poveglia should remain a public good, not a private trophy. Then in July 2025, Italy's state property agency granted a 6-year concession for the northern, undeveloped portion of the island to the civic association Poveglia per Tutti. That may sound like reopening, but only if you blur the island into one undifferentiated myth. The northern section is not the same as unrestricted access to the hazardous built-up core. That distinction matters. Nobody may enter was never the whole truth. It was the version most useful to headlines and ghost hunters. So what is being kept out now? Not plague in the 18th century sense, but the logic of quarantine never disappeared. It shifted. Today, the built-up parts are still bound up with state ownership, preservation issues, and physical danger. Crumbling structures do not care whether the person entering believes in spirits or not. Rotten floors collapse the same way for everyone. Broken masonry, unsecured interiors, and decades of deterioration create a hazard that does not need folklore. It is already there in the walls. There is also a third threat: crowds. Once a place is branded cursed, curiosity spreads like contamination. One video brings 10 boats. 10 boats bring trespass, vandalism, stripped materials, injuries, rescue problems, and a history site reduced to props. The ghost story does not just sit on top of the island. It changes what reaches the shore. Poveglia's most famous legend hides the documented reason barriers keep returning. First, to sort the sick from the healthy, then to control an institution, then to keep abandoned remains from being consumed by thrill-seeking traffic. You come in expecting apparitions. You find a public health outpost from 1793, a care facility that closed in 1968, a ruin unstable enough to injure intruders, and a legal status complicated enough that one part can be under a 6-year civic concession, while the dangerous core remains off-limits. Beyond the broken windows, the most ordinary explanation is still the one that stops people at the shore. A landing, a few steps through the weeds, one staircase, then the floor gives way. Number 3. The island where evolution loaded the weapon. 33 kilometers is not far. On a clear day off the coast of Sao Paulo, it looks survivable, almost casual. But the island out there covers only about 430,000 square meters, 43 hectares. Inside that small space, evolution did something unnervingly efficient with a pit viper. The island's food chain developed a venom problem. In April 1920, herpetologist Afrânio do Amaral stepped onto Ilha da Queimada Grande and examined the snake that would later be scientifically recognized as Bothrops insularis, the golden lancehead. He was not looking at a television myth. He was looking at an isolated population, cut off from mainland Brazil roughly 9,000 years earlier, when rising sea levels turned a hilltop into an island. That isolation matters. Sometimes a barrier is not hiding a secret. It is containing a biological experiment that kept going on its own. Look at the map first. 33 kilometers offshore sounds close, but for a terrestrial predator, it is an evolutionary wall. When the sea rose, whatever lived on that outcrop had to survive on whatever the island could still provide. On the mainland, lanceheads hunt across a broader menu. On Queimada Grande, that menu narrowed hard. Recent work cited by Butantan notes just one resident bird species on the island. These snakes did not become simply more snakes on less land. They were forced into a different hunting life. Now look at the body. This is a pit viper built to strike, inject venom, and let chemistry finish what distance and terrain might not. On the island, the problem was not only killing prey, it was keeping prey from escaping. A mammal bitten on the ground may stagger and collapse nearby. A bird can burst into the air, drop off a branch, or disappear over the slope. That is the pressure point. The island favored a snake that could hit prey that would not stay put. You can see that shift in behavior before you get anywhere near legend. The golden lancehead is strongly associated with arboreal habits. It spends substantial time in branches. It hunts birds. It uses the island's vertical space in a way that fits the prey available there. This is not a ground viper copied and pasted onto a rock. It is the result of thousands of years with a narrow food chain, steep terrain, and meals with wings. The numbers people repeat about Snake Island are usually the wrong ones. The internet loves the line about one snake per square meter. It is vivid. It is easy. It is also misleading. A scientific review of online material found widespread misinformation about the island's density claims and venom claims, because sensational versions spread better than measured ones. A better estimate for the golden lancehead population is around 2,000 individuals. On 43 hectares, that is still a serious concentration, just not the campfire version. What matters more is response time. You are 33 kilometers offshore, on an island where public landings are restricted. The terrain is rough. The animal is an endemic venomous snake found nowhere else on Earth. Before anyone even starts talking about toxicity, the logistics are already against you. You are not beside a road. You are not walking into a nearby emergency room. You are on a protected island, where access is generally limited to authorized researchers and lighthouse personnel. The whole system is built for controlled entry, not casual rescue for trespassers. A bite here does not begin with panic. It begins with open water between you and help. That is why the island's human story narrows so quickly. A lighthouse was built there in the early 20th century, and keepers once lived on the island with their families. By 1918, the lighthouse had been automated. The strongest accessible official account says permanent crews left because maintaining them there had become impractical. Not a documented massacre, not a folktale ending. Something colder. The place was difficult enough, dangerous enough, and isolated enough that routine human presence was designed out. The island's forbidden status does two jobs at once. It protects visitors from a venomous population shaped by isolation, and it protects that population from visitors. Illegal collectors do not need many landings to damage a species that exists only here. Careless tourism does not need many footsteps to turn a controlled research site into a trampled spectacle. The barrier is not just about fear. It prevents intrusion into a closed ecological loop that took millennia to form and could be disrupted in a season. By now, the shape of the answer is clear. Isolation made the golden lancehead different because the island stripped away the old options. No broad mainland prey base, no easy move into another habitat. A small area, a prey field dominated by birds. Selection favored snakes that climbed, waded in branches, struck fast, and relied on venom to stop an animal that could otherwise vanish beyond the canopy. This was not simply more venom for more danger. It was venom shaped by escape. That is what makes Snake Island stranger than the horror story. Queimada Grande is not forbidden because it has too many snakes for people. It is forbidden because on 43 hectares, after 9,000 years of separation, evolution produced a snake that hunts as if losing sight of its prey means losing the meal. Number 2. The shoreline that outsiders must not cross. On this island, all are well and healthy. That was the line Indian officials used after an aerial check in the aftermath of the Indian Ocean tsunami, when a helicopter passed over North Sentinel and saw a man on the beach aiming a bow at the aircraft below. On December 26, 2004, walls of water tore across the Andaman Sea and lifted coastlines out of place. Reefs around North Sentinel rose. Parts of the shoreline changed shape. From the air, it looked like a possible humanitarian emergency on a small, heavily forested island. North Sentinel is home to the Sentinelese, a people who have maintained prolonged separation from the outside world, and whose documented encounters with visitors have been rare, brief, and often hostile. But when the Coast Guard came close, the answer from the beach was not distress. It was refusal, arrows, warning gestures, stay back. That response shaped policy. Indian law forbids landing on the island and restricts entry to the sea around it, extending a protected zone 5 kilometers from the high water mark. On an island ringed by reefs and difficult to monitor continuously, that offshore distance matters. By the time a boat reaches the beach, authorities may have little chance to prevent an encounter. For years, officials and anthropologists approached cautiously from offshore, sometimes leaving coconuts, sometimes observing, sometimes backing away. On January 4, 1991, an anthropological survey of India team recorded the first peaceful physical contact. About 28 Sentinelese came forward. There was a second encounter on February 21, 1991, calmer by most accounts, with anthropologist T.N. Pandit involved in the expedition. For a moment, from a great distance in every sense, it appeared that a limited exchange might be possible. But the records from those meetings are fragmentary. They reveal far more about what outsiders observed than what the Sentinelese intended. A gift exchange from a boat did not create an ongoing relationship, and a shoreline approach did not establish permission for future visits. After 1991, the Indian government moved away from contact expeditions. The consequence was practical. Researchers, officials, and visitors would no longer treat curiosity as a reason to approach. Then came January 27, 2006. Two fishermen, Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari, were sleeping in their boat when it drifted toward the island. They were killed after crossing into the restricted waters. Their deaths showed a different risk. The boundary is not merely a rule for people deliberately seeking the island. Currents, weather, and mechanical failure can turn an ordinary fishing trip into a lethal encounter within hours. It also exposed a problem authorities could not solve simply by sending in help. A drifting boat can carry fuel, food, tools, nets, and contamination. Any recovery operation would require more boats, more people, and more time near shore. The immediate danger was to the fishermen. The longer-term danger was that an accidental breach could become a chain of further incursions. The Sentinelese population is often estimated at around 50 people in official Indian answers, though the government has been explicit that no direct population survey has been conducted. Even the figure most often repeated is not a head count. It is an estimate based on distant observation. That uncertainty has consequences. No one outside the island can reliably assess the population's health, age structure, or immunity. A visitor carrying a routine respiratory virus, gastrointestinal infection, or skin disease could introduce an outbreak without recognizing it. Which brings you to dawn on November 17, 2018. American missionary John Allen Chau is in a small boat off North Sentinel Island, having paid local fishermen to take him toward a coast he already knows he is forbidden to approach. He has tried before. He has brought fish and gifts. He has tried to speak. On one earlier approach, an arrow struck the Bible he was holding. Most people would read that as the message ending the story. He read it as resistance to overcome. So he went back. He instructed the fishermen to leave him behind. From offshore, they later watched islanders drag his body toward the beach and bury it in the sand. Indian authorities chose not to recover the remains. The decision was not an abandonment of the case. It was a calculation about consequences. A recovery party would have had to land or approach closely, risking a violent confrontation and possible disease transmission. The government investigated from outside the island, but did not authorize a landing. Chau's death made the exclusion zone more than a warning on a map. It became a limit on what the state itself could do. Police could arrest those who arranged the illegal trip. Officials could question witnesses and investigate the route, but they could not carry out every action that would normally follow a death at sea. The island's isolation constrained rescue, recovery, and criminal investigation alike. Yet the danger did not end with Chau. On March 29, 2025, American visitor Mikhailo Viktorovich Polyakov landed briefly on North Sentinel Island. He was arrested 2 days later. His case introduced another problem. Enforcement often begins after the breach. A person can evade patrols, hire a boat, cross the restricted water, and reach shore before authorities know an approach is underway. That leaves a narrow and difficult task for Indian authorities. They must deter boats from entering the zone, investigate those who facilitate illegal trips, and avoid turning enforcement into the very contact the restrictions are meant to prevent. The next person who reaches North Sentinel may not be stopped at the waterline, and once that happens, every available response carries its own risk. Number 1. The ancient entrance that still kills. At dusk in ancient Hierapolis, the proof arrived on 4 legs. An animal was led toward a stone opening beside the Temple of Apollo. It stepped into the low vapor pooling over the ground, and within moments, it dropped. The priests did not. They came back out alive, as if the god below had accepted one body and spared another. In the late 1st century BCE, or early 1st century CE, the geographer Strabo described the place in terms so blunt they still feel modern. He wrote that sparrows thrown inside died at once, not after a ritual, not after a long exposure, immediately. At Hierapolis, in what is now western Turkey, the sanctuary called the Plutonion, Pluto's Gate, stood over a fissure where hot water and toxic gas rose from the earth. Ancient visitors saw birds collapse. They saw larger animals die near the entrance. They concluded that this was the breath of the underworld god himself. It sounds mythical now, but the danger was real long before anyone could explain it with chemistry. How could ancient witnesses know the cave was deadly before anyone understood carbon dioxide? The Earth kept showing them, again and again, in public. The sanctuary was built around that display. Beside the temple, over the fault, sat a roofed chamber only about 3 square meters at the entrance. In front of it stretched an area of roughly 2,000 square meters, where the gas could spread in a low, invisible sheet. Carbon dioxide is denser than ordinary air. It does not rise like smoke into the sky. It sinks, it collects, it stays close to the floor. The first body to enter the worst layer is usually the lowest one. The pattern of death became evidence. Birds, goats, small animals brought near the opening. No laboratory reading was needed. People could watch it happen. An animal lowered its head, inhaled near the ground, staggered, and collapsed. A standing human, moving carefully and keeping his face above the densest layer, might survive a brief approach. To a crowd outside, that would not look like fluid dynamics. It would look like selection. The god kills what he wants and spares whom he favors. The priests stepped directly into that belief. Ancient accounts say they could approach the gate and return apparently unharmed. Maybe they held their breath. Maybe they knew exactly where the safer pockets of air were. Maybe ritual choreography did part of the work. The sources do not let us reconstruct every trick of the performance. They do not have to. The geology carried most of it. The miracle had a mechanism. Modern measurements show how brutal that mechanism was. Investigations at the site reported carbon dioxide concentrations reaching roughly 80% near the active vent. 80%. A few minutes at 10% can already be fatal. Near the fissure, the concentration was not just dangerous, it was far beyond survivable. The ancient stories read less like legends than witness statements. The animals were not symbolic sacrifices, proving a belief. They were biological detectors, proving a hazard. Now put yourself there at sunrise, before the heat of the day disperses anything. You are standing at the edge of an opening in the rock. The air looks normal. The stone looks normal. The chamber is small, the kind of space your body reads as manageable. But the kill zone is not just the doorway. It is the layer spread out in front of it, close to the ground, invisible and still. If you kneel, if you stumble, if a child or animal puts its face down into that band of gas, the margin disappears fast. That height-dependent danger explains the whole spectacle. Ancient observers did not need to know the molecule. They watched death sort bodies by distance from the ground. The lower the lungs, the sooner the collapse. A priest staying upright for seconds or a minute was not proof the gate was harmless. It was proof the gate had rules. By the 4th century CE, the sanctuary was still functioning. For centuries, pilgrims came to a place where religion and geology fused into one machine. People paid for access to an oracle because the landscape itself seemed to answer. Then the Christian era closed or blocked the sanctuary. The closure did not neutralize the fault below it. The crack in the earth stayed what it had always been. In 2013, Italian archaeologists, led by Francesco D'Andrea, helped bring the rediscovered plutonion back into wide public view. Since 1988, Hierapolis Pamukkale has been protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Prestige does not make the entrance safe. If anything, the science makes the old fear easier to respect. This was never just a theatrical ruin attached to a superstition. It was a functioning natural trap that ancient people learned to read with terrifying accuracy. Sometimes, a barrier protects a fragile site from us. Sometimes, it protects a people from contact. Sometimes, the warning is simpler than that. The place itself will kill whoever treats it like scenery. Officially, Pluto's Gate is a restricted archaeological zone inside a famous heritage site. On the ground, it is still what the first witnesses believed they had found, an entrance where the earth breathes death, and where stepping too low can be the only mistake you get.